Hello, this is Dan Handelman with Flying Focus Video Collective and Portland Copwatch, and this is part two of our show about police settlements, shootings, and other misconduct. And I'm hosting it with Jasmin from KBOO Radio. The first episode, we looked at the top 6 out of the top 25 settlements from Portland Police, and now we're going to continue that list. The next four are Terrell Johnson, who you talked about already, um, Damon Lowery, Jason Cox, and Raymond Gwerder. You already mentioned how Terrell Johnson was chased by this officer who tripped and fell. That's not the only time we've seen an officer trip and fall and then shoot somebody after they tripped and fell. There's 3 or 4 cases that we keep citing where that happened, and we just wonder why they don't train officers about how to walk backwards. The most recent shooting death here, which was a Michael Townsend in June of 2021, the officer was backing up because Townsend was allegedly coming at him with something that looked like a screwdriver, but he didn't take cover. He just stayed in the middle of his parking lot and shot Mr. Johnson to death. Mr. Johnson was also in mental health crisis. So I think there's a lot of training they do about how to use a weapon and how to aim it and how to shoot at people. And you're supposed to shoot, and people always think that we have a shoot to kill policies. Like, they should know. They're saying it's a shoot until the threat is stopped, is how they phrase it, which could mean the person's just lying there bleeding, but more often than not, when there's multiple shots fired by the police, the person is going to be dead. So Damon Lowery was somebody who was tripping on some drugs and actually jumped out of the second-story window of a building, and the police ended up standing on him, which caused basically him to be unable to breathe, and he was taken to the hospital, and he died from his injuries from what the police did to him more than what happened to him from the fall. That was just another horrible, tragic thing. It's not one of those cases that a lot of people know about. Jason Cox was beaten by officers, and one of the only reasons that he got such a high jury award, and this was the first jury award we've come across, everything else has been a settlement, is that there was video. There actually was a surveillance video that showed the officers doing to Jason Cox what he said they did, but they claimed differently. So this is, talked a little bit, I mentioned the word body cameras before. So here's the issue with body cameras. That surveillance camera was a third-party video. That's why our group is called Copwatch, because we observe the police. We want other people to do that, to record the police from a third-party standpoint. Anybody who watched a horrific video of George Floyd dying, a body camera of that would have been the officer's point of view, and he was, standing, looking at the crowd, kind of proudly murdering George Floyd, and his body was not turned towards George Floyd, nor was it turned to himself, which was really important. So, body cameras might be able to tell us some stuff and help sort out what got said, but more often than not, it's not going to contain the information that we need to know what the officers did. But this Jason Cox case shows why third-party footage is important. And then the last one I'm going to talk about is Raymond Gwerder, another horrific situation. There was a young man who was in a mental health crisis and feeling suicidal, and there was a sniper, and this is a repeat officer who we call the $1 Million Man because he's been sued, cost the city so much money from being sued so often. Leo Besner, he was a sniper, and Gwerder was on the phone with a 911 operator and talking to them about, they were trying to talk to him about, what's going on in your life, and he said, I've got this dog, and they're really, sometimes very, not naughty. I'm paraphrasing here. But, sometimes the dog's very naughty, and then all of a sudden you hear Raymond Gwerder go, and that is because he was walking back into the house, and the Leo Besner thought that he was going to go and do something bad, so he decided to shoot and kill him. And nothing happened to Leo Besner. He was not found out of policy for that shooting. And the family got a $500,000 settlement. I think part of the reason that we focused on the lawsuits is because, this, as you said before, this is coming out of taxpayers' pockets, and this is money that could be spent on other things like housing and parks and things that people want, instead of going out to pay for misdeeds that the police did And one of the things that you talked about very briefly was the number of officers who broke into people's fences and stuff. Out of the cases that we have, we found that there were at least 21 cases where they damaged fences with either with a car or by hand, sometimes to gain access to yards, chasing suspects. And the total payouts, it's not that high. It's $11,679. But it's the principle of the thing. And you have to also think that sometimes these are homeowners or maybe even renters who don't want to ruffle feathers. Like, we didn't hear about a lot of these cases because they were filed quietly. They cost less than $5,000 a piece. And, the people didn't go to the media and say, hey, the police broke my fence to try to chase after the suspect. But they filed a claim, and they said they wanted their property made right. In some cases, in a couple of cases, they even cut locks off and things like that. Sometimes it was to get access for the canine, for their dogs to get into the yards. In terms of the spike strips we talked about before, we found 18 cases of that where the wrong car was hit with spike strips and their tires were blown out, a total of just over $10,000. There were 9 cases where they said they were caretaking. So in other words, they were called because somebody was worried that the person was not in a good health situation, right? So that they had to go into the house and see whether the person was okay. And they broke down doors, they broke through windows. They ended up spending roughly $5,000 total on repairing those people's doors and windows. And then in 7 cases where we found negligence, where they, for instance, they didn't tell people that they recovered their stolen car and that kind of thing. And in one case, I just have to laugh at this one. Somebody, they had their car towed to the tow yard and a bird pooped in the window, and the city actually paid out money for this, $90. The total for those negligence cases, like $3,100. So there was a lot of like these individual cases and things that, in that case, that was one of those cases we call the negligence case, because it's not like the police officer knew the bird was going to poop in the window of the car. But it's just, it's all these things that add up from a society where we're so dependent on these armed agents of the state to so-called enforce the law. But that's not always what they're doing.
We've talked a little bit about, sort of this rampaging force, but I wonder what does this mean to you that these lawsuits are happening, that we're seeing the property destruction, that we're seeing somewhat limited use of force? What does it mean from if you go a step beyond like observing the problem? What do we get from this knowledge that this is happening?
Well, I think what we talked about before is that these officers are doing these things and causing harm to the people or their property. And we didn't even start talking about, like, they took people's cell phones away and lost them. They put somebody's phone on top of the police car and drove off, and the phone got damaged. I mean, there's all sorts of things where, if you or I did it, we'd probably get fired from our jobs. There'd probably be consequences for us, but there's no consequence for the individual officers. And I think that one of the reasons that we highlight this is because of these outrageous behaviors that don't lead to any kind of discipline. And there are state laws about protecting people who are government employees who are being investigated, but then the exception is that when it's in the public's interest, they can release the records. Well, we have argued for years that, like the people who, make sure that the water mains are in good shape and then do something wrong, don't carry guns and don't have the same kind of powers and authority that police do. So, maybe there's some people who are interested in everything the water department does, or the water bureau, but, the police are very unique in terms of government employees. The state hires them to enforce the law using violence, basically. I mean, essentially, that's basically what they do. And every one of these cases should have made it into the newspaper, even if it's just in a little blotter that says, the city paid out $350 for this person whose fence was broken or something. But people should be really interested in this stuff because we made a social contract, and I wasn't part of that. It didn't happen long before I was born, where we said there's going to be this thing called the police, and this is what they're going to do. But I think part of that social contract has to be, if they're going to do that job, we want them to do it in a way that doesn't harm the community and doesn't damage people's property. And of course, human life is much more valuable than property, and I don't want to conflate those two things. So that was a problematic argument that happened about the protesting last year, where protesters were damaging property. But still, if these police are caretakers of the community, we shouldn't be seeing these. The top 25 settlements we have just by themselves have cost Portland taxpayers basically almost $14.5 million. That's from 1993 until today.
The $14.3 million total for just the top 25 cases does not include another $4.8 million paid out to over 400 other people from 1993 to early 2021, including all of those under $120,000, which was the 25th highest payment amount, and the many incidents where they paid out less than $5,000.
Then we had $4.5 million in negligence cases, and then those traffic crashes I talked about before is another $950,000, so almost another $1 million in that. So when you add them all together, it's $24.7 million in taxpayer money that we've tracked just in the last 28 and a half years for these various kinds of police actions.
Beyond financial awards, is there another benefit? Is there another public benefit to going through the court process? Do we get access to more information? Do we learn things that would otherwise be in the dark?
To me, that's an important thing, not only about the lawsuits, but about the filing of complaints as well. That the officers need to go on record to explain why they did what they did. In the forums that we have around complaints, when there's an appeal, like when it's just a complaint, we don't find out what happened. When there's an appeal, you find out a lot about what happened. That's one of the reasons we've been supportive of the IPR and citizen review committee system that exists, even though it's not perfect. It's given us a window to learn what these officers are saying. And in a courtroom, they have to talk about what happened. And for what it's worth, every shooting that ends in a death and many shootings that end up in a wounding, but few shootings that end up where the person's not hurt, go before a grand jury here in Multnomah County. And starting with Aaron Campbell, they've made it a practice to release the transcripts and all those. You find out all sorts of things in there, and including stuff where the officers are being coached by the district attorney. And it just sort of shows this, kind of close relationship. Now, Mike Schmidt, who's the current district attorney, has tried to turn that around a little bit. He's trying to put these cases, and I don't even know who's handling the most recent shootings cases, but we know that the shooting of Robert Delgado in April is being handled by the state alongside the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office, which is, that brings in the fresh eyes that aren't working with the Portland Police on a day-to-day basis, which is really important. Yes, when we get the paperwork from these things, now that's one of the problems with settlements, that they don't talk about what happened. And if we don't talk about what happened, we're not going to learn how to fix what happened. So when City Council has these hearings, what I do every single time is say, look, City Council, you need to talk about the policy issues that underlie this case so that it doesn't happen again. And they sit there and give me what I call the City Council stare, and they just, they don't want to talk about it. The two most recent cases being the exception in a way, the Quantis Hayes and Terrell Johnson cases, they didn't really talk about the policies, but they did express their remorse that the family had suffered a loss, which is a step forward, and which could legally bind them to spending more money, but because the settlements were already pretty much signed, sealed, and delivered, again, that didn't cost the city any money. The Grand Canyon was dug by water running through it over thousands of years. So there have been little changes here and there. There are little things that have changed. Like Kendra James, the officers involved in killing Kendra James at the traffic stop went out to a restaurant afterward and talked about the case before they got interviewed. And Dr. Haynes from the Alabama Ministerial Alliance Coalition for Justice and Police Reform refers to that a lot. That is not allowed anymore. They're given restriction orders. So if they did that today, they theoretically would be disciplined for doing that.
Important Copwatch compiles or maintains a list of officers involved in deadly force incidents, including information about when officers have been involved in multiple situations over the course of their career, and whether or not those officers are still, sometimes they're not off, sometimes they're sergeants and other things, but whether or not those bureau personnel are still active in policing. Can you walk us through that?
This is based on something that The Intercept did around officers in Chicago, where they had one dot for every time an officer would use deadly force. So we just did that for Portland Police. And we included officers involved in like the Damon Lowery case where the multiple officers stood on him, and Dickie Dow, who we haven't talked about yet, who was beaten down in 1998 by officers. He's in the top 25 list. His family received a big settlement for that. But we didn't, for instance, include when you talked about Deputy Chief Davis, who, as you mentioned, is moving to Green Bay. We didn't include him in the Jose Mejia case because he fired a less lethal weapon while Jeff Bell fired a regular firearm. This data may be updated by the time people are watching the show. This was the version from October of 2020 where we represented 207 officers. Since that time, there have been 5 more incidents, so there's now 212 officers. None of the 5 officers had been involved in previous incidents. There were 177 distinct incidents, which now at least 182. But you'll see that the dots, the clear dots represent officers who are no longer on the force. And I'm going to hover over one of them so you can see the Sergeant James Mooney, who shot and killed Jeb Brock. So we have the dots that represent if they're not on the force anymore, the clear dots. Then we have this section, as you said, that officers involved in 2 deadly force incidents and officers involved in 3 deadly force incidents, of which there are only 3, and as of last year, 2 of them were still on the police force. And one of these dots is Leo Besner, who eventually got promoted to lieutenant, and a lot of these officers end up getting promoted after being involved. One other thing I want to talk about is I mentioned briefly that we've been tracking Oregon shooting deadly force incidents actually since 2010 after the death of Aaron Campbell. So we have entire decades worth of data now, now 11 years, including 2020. The average number of shootings per year was around 25 per year until just before Donald Trump got in office. Then it jumped up to being about 35. Well, no, it jumped up to being 28 a year when you look at the whole of the 11 years. But the last 3 or 4 years have been about 35 shooting or deadly force incidents a year. And I can't explain that. It's not a national phenomenon, at least not according to the Washington Post, who, by the way, only track cases where the people get killed by the police. Just so you can see the spreadsheet a little bit of all these deadly force cases. And this includes officers ramming people with their cars, tasering people to death, and other such things. So it starts, as I said, with Aaron Campbell in 2010. And I'm going to kind of scroll down here. Just to give you a basic idea, you can see Portland Police have the most shootings of all the police departments in the state, and I'll pull up those data in just a second. And these data only go through the end of 2020. We've been tracking 2021. Right now, as of the end of August 2021, there have been at least 25 deadly force incidents by police in this state, which means we could go past the previous record of 38 in a year if they don't start holstering their guns, stop harming our community members. So we send a letter to the Attorney General every year about these data because there's a Senate bill that was passed in 2007 called SB 111 that required every agency in the state to come up with a plan, or every county in the state to come up with a plan about what they're going to do when there's a deadly force incident involving police, and then also for the state to track every time police officers kill somebody. That has been voluntary, and it's very incomplete, the data on their website. And we also think that because when an officer shoots somebody and either misses them or hits them and wounds them, we would be charged with attempted murder if we did that to another civilian. So we should really be tracking even the ones that did not end in a death. There's a letter to Attorney General Rosenblum from 2021 covering the incidents from 2010 to 2020. And there were 304 incidents total. And the agency involved in the most was the Portland Police with 52. So you can sort of see all the data from there. We broke it down year by year, what kinds of incidents there were, how many were from Portland, how many were deaths in custody as opposed to shootings or taser-related deaths. We broke down race and gender and age. So we don't have complete data on those things. We talked about whether they were veterans or were in a mental health crisis, and again, those are not complete data always. So that's just another project that we have going on here. And it's, you know, they all kind of relate to each other. The officers who are involved in shootings, graphics, the settlements, and then what's going on around the state.
I guess I just wonder, like, what more proof do we need that they have violated the contract that was made, that they are, or that maybe they haven't violated the contract, that they're actually functioning with the same carelessness and with the same privilege that they've been functioning with from the beginning, and that, you know, they're protecting the property of people other than the people whose houses that they're breaking into, that they're protecting the lives of other than the people that they're shooting to death, that they're, I don't know, that they're not going to learn, that they don't want to learn, that they've certainly had many, many iterative opportunities to change. And we are now, you know, almost 10 years into a settlement with the Department of Justice, and it's getting worse. They're going deeper and deeper into their corner, and relying more and more on public fear to legitimize the job that they're doing. And I don't know. I think it's completely right for the public to be outraged about this, and for the public to be outraged both about the human cost of this and about the community cost of this. And they overlap and they're a little bit different, but I wonder where that outrage goes.
We're talking in the summer of 2021, and last summer there was a huge uprising after George Floyd was murdered, and people were trapped inside, forced to watch it. They weren't distracted by sports and other things that normally distract people, and there was a large movement. People, especially in Portland, we had like 170 nights, the police say, where people were out there protesting in the streets. But even though there's still some police people protesting against police violence out on the streets, that movement has already sort of started to lose momentum, because the powers that be that want to perpetuate the system you're talking about are turning things on their head again and saying, oh, well, look, we defunded the police last year, and here in Portland now we have all these shootings, community member shootings, and it's up by X percent, and so we need to have more police. But frankly, in 2020, there were only 2 officer-involved shootings the whole year, and neither of them killed anybody in Portland. And as of July, there had been 4 officer-involved shootings, 2 of which were fatal. So we've had a 100% increase over the entirety of last year in just the first 7 months of the year, and nobody's talking about that. There are a lot of people who want police accountability. There are a lot of people who want to dismantle the police as an institution, but I don't know if we're going to be able to get to a society that doesn't rely on the police as we know them, unless the people who keep getting outraged when Michael Brown got killed in Ferguson and when George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis, that they don't keep paying attention. And I feel like they have these little bursts, and then the powers that be kind of lull everybody back into, well, the only people who are going to protect you from the bad guys, quote unquote, and I hate that term, but that's what they say, are the police. So I think that's part of the problem, that we, there's this baked-in institutional problem. So I think the more things we do that find ways that will outrage people to the point where they say, let's find other things to spend our money on, like, there's this thing called Portland Street Response now in Portland. Now, I'm not sure, it's not a perfect thing, but we got a fire bureau member going out with somebody with a mental health degree, and they go and help people in mental health crisis instead of sending an armed police officer. And we got to think of more things like that, where, and the city is even talking about, or at least the new head of public safety, his name is Mike Myers, is talking about maybe the Bureau of Transportation should handle traffic stops instead of police officers. Because when somebody's violating, going through a stop sign, you don't have to point a gun at them. So we have to keep thinking of ways to replace what the police are doing, if those are important things to society. I mean, obviously, I think people running stop signs and hurting people is very bad. But if we think that these things are important to quote unquote enforce, that doesn't have to always be police. And the more we keep thinking about that and putting that back on the table, maybe we'll get to a place where we're not having these ongoing damages. It seems like a good place to kind of wrap up the show. So I'm Dan Handelman with Portland Copwatch and Flying Focus Video Collective, and I've been here tonight with Jasmin. Do you want to have any last words?
I guess my last words would be that that you've made a lot of really good points as far as how continuing to stay engaged and continuing to stay focused on change is meaningful. And even though I joke about being a cynic, I think that you've made a lot of really good points about how to keep going. And that, that includes showing up, that includes paying attention to information that's available, that includes filing complaints and filing appeals and filing lawsuits and speaking out publicly and doing all those things. So I'm always a little bit more optimistic after we talk. So I appreciate that.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. And thanks for joining us on the Flying Focus Video Bus.